There is a quiet moment when a person realizes that something is wrong, not with the world, but with the way they relate to themselves. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no defining event, just an internal exhaustion, a kind of wear that appears when you look at your own life and notice that despite so much effort, so many concessions, so much adaptation, respect never lasts. People come and go. Situations repeat themselves. And deep down, there is this uncomfortable feeling that something essential is being lost every time you try to please, give in, or explain yourself too much. This discomfort usually shows up when someone starts to notice that they are always adjusting in order to fit, adjusting their tone of voice, their opinions, their limits, their desires. Not because they want to, but because they learned that being accepted requires it. And the cost of this constant adaptation is not immediate. It builds up slowly, first as mild frustration, then as restrained irritation, later as a sense of emptiness that is hard to name. Until one day, a quiet question appears. Why is it that even when I do everything right, nothing that comes my way actually feels good? Many people believe that attracting better things in life depends on external effort, on performance, on becoming more interesting, more useful, more available. Few realize that there is a direct relationship between the value you give yourself and the kinds of experiences you accept as normal. When someone does not respect themselves internally, they begin to bargain away their own worth in small installments. And these negotiations do not happen only in big moments, but in the details. In tolerating what hurts, in accepting conversations that drain you, in staying in environments where dignity has to be constantly defended. This process does not begin consciously. No one wakes up one day deciding to devalue themselves. It grows out of old lessons, often invisible ones, from childhoods where affection was conditional, from environments where mistakes cost love, from relationships where silence was used as punishment. Little by little, the mind learns that its value depends on the reaction of others. It learns that saying no threatens connection. It learns that setting boundaries leads to rejection. And so a distorted internal logic is formed. In order to be chosen, you must make yourself smaller. The problem is that this logic does not go unnoticed by the world. People sense it, even if they cannot explain it, when someone does not place themselves as a priority in their own life. They sense when someone does not protect their boundaries. They sense when someone is always too available, too understanding, too flexible. And contrary to what many imagine, this does not create respect. It creates permissiveness, it creates unbalanced relationships. It creates situations where the other person takes up more space than they should. The pain that comes from this does not stem only from the actions of others, but from a quiet betrayal of oneself. Because at some level the person knows they accepted what was unacceptable, that they stayed where there was no longer reciprocity, that they explained themselves too much when simply walking away would have been enough. And this awareness, even when suppressed, exacts its price. It turns into self-criticism, into a sense of weakness, into a quiet shame for not having protected oneself. Stoicism looks at this kind of suffering directly, without ornament or excuse. For the Stoics, dignity is not something granted by others, but something preserved internally. They understood that the human mind suffers not so much because of what happens, but because of the value it assigns to external things. When someone places their self-worth in the hands of others, they also hand over their peace of mind. And the world, unstable by nature, does not return it intact. There is a common confusion between humility and self-denial. Many people believe that valuing yourself is arrogance, that setting boundaries is selfish, that choosing yourself is a sign of hardness. But Stoicism does not defend arrogance. It defends inner integrity. It does not advocate isolation, but emotional autonomy. In this view, valuing yourself is not about placing yourself above others, but about refusing to place yourself below what is reasonable. When someone does not value themselves, they begin to accept emotional crumbs as if they were full meals. Small gestures of attention become oversized rewards. Any sign of recognition is magnified. And this creates a dangerous imbalance, because the individual starts to depend on external stimuli to feel that they exist. Their peace begins to fluctuate according to other people's moods, according to replies, messages, looks, approvals. The mind then enters a constant state of vigilance. It watches too much, interprets too much, reacts too much, and the more it reacts, the more it loses its center. Stoicism warned that a mind like this lives enslaved to factors it does not control. It does not decide when it feels well. It waits. It reacts. It adjusts. And in that process, it drifts away from its own reason. The root of this problem is not a lack of external love, but the absence of a clearly defined internal value. When someone does not know with clarity what is acceptable and what is not, everything becomes negotiable. When there are no firm internal criteria, any relationship can impose itself, and the individual begins to confuse intensity with quality, attention with respect, need with connection. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes relevant, not as theory, but as an uncomfortable mirror. It asks, what exactly are you trying to protect when you accept what diminishes you? What are you afraid of losing when you do not take a stand? What seems so valuable that it justifies giving up your own peace? These questions do not bring immediate answers. They simply reveal the conflict. They reveal that many times the fear of loneliness weighs more than self-respect. They reveal that the desire to belong can be stronger than the commitment to one's own integrity. And as long as this imbalance exists, life will continue to present experiences that reflect this internal disorder. This is not about blaming yourself, but about assuming clarity. Stoicism does not accuse, it holds you responsible. It teaches that the mind needs governance just as a city needs laws. Without clear criteria, everything enters. Without boundaries, everything invades. And the cost of this unrestricted openness is paid in the form of ongoing emotional exhaustion. When someone begins to notice this, something shifts internally. There is still no concrete change, there is still no full strength. There is only a new restlessness, an uncomfortable suspicion that perhaps the problem is not only in the people who arrive, but in the way one stays. Not in the world, but in one's own stance toward it. This initial awareness does not solve anything. It simply opens a crack in the old logic. A crack through which the idea begins to enter that personal value is not proven, not negotiated, not begged for. It is upheld. And as long as it is not upheld internally, any attempt to attract something better will continue to fail, because what is truly better does not remain where reason is not protected, where boundaries are fragile, and where one's own dignity is treated as secondary, as something adjustable according to others' reactions, as something that has not yet found a firm point of support within one's own awareness. From that initial crack, the way a person sees things begins to change, even if unsteadily. They start noticing patterns that once felt like mere coincidences, conversations that always end the same way, relationships where nearly all the effort comes from one side, situations where discomfort shows up early, but is ignored out of fear of losing the little that has been offered. None of this appears as one big, isolated mistake, but as a predictable sequence of small concessions that, when added together, create a life that is emotionally expensive and spiritually cheap. Stoicism helps clarify that suffering rarely comes from chance. It is usually the result of repeated inner habits, not external habits but mental dispositions. The tendency to justify what cannot be justified. The inclination to take responsibility for emotions that are not yours. The automatic impulse to overexplain, overgive, overtolerate. These behaviors do not arise because a person is weak, but because at some point in life they learned that preserving connections mattered more than preserving their own clarity. In daily life, this shows up in almost imperceptible ways. Accepting invitations when exhausted, just to avoid disappointing someone. Laughing at comments that diminish you in order to avoid conflict. Staying in touch with people who have already shown disrespect, hoping that with enough patience they will change. Each of these choices seems too small to justify a break. But the impact is not in each isolated act. It is in the silent repetition. Over time, the body begins to send signals, a fatigue that does not go away, a diffuse irritation, a constant feeling of being emotionally indebted. The mind becomes overly occupied with other people's behavior, trying to anticipate, adjust, avoid displeasing. And while this is happening, something essential is neglected: one's own reason. Stoicism has always warned that when the mind becomes reactive, it stops governing and starts being governed. There is also a common misinterpretation that keeps this cycle alive. Many believe that valuing yourself means becoming rigid, distant, cutting people off. And out of fear of becoming cold or lonely, they continue placing themselves second. But this is a false dichotomy. The problem is not closeness. It is the absence of criteria. Not affection, but the lack of internal boundaries. When there is no clarity about what is acceptable, everything is tolerated in the name of maintaining connection. Stoicism proposes a subtle but profound shift, moving out of the logic of reaction and into the logic of conscious choice. This does not happen overnight. At first, the person simply begins to notice discomfort earlier. They recognize the exact moment something crosses an internal line, even if they still cannot name it. This initial awareness does not immediately change behavior, but it creates a pause, a small space between stimulus and response. In that space, new thoughts begin to emerge, still fragile. Questions that did not exist before. Why am I accepting this? What am I actually trying to preserve here? What am I sacrificing in exchange for staying? These questions do not lead to immediate action, but they begin to erode the old justification that it's not that bad. The mind starts to understand that the emotional cost is being paid continuously, even when nothing explodes outwardly. The long-term consequences of this pattern are deep. Self-esteem does not disappear all at once. It erodes. The person begins to doubt their own judgment. They start seeking validation for simple decisions. They feel guilty for prioritizing their own well-being. And the more this happens, the harder it becomes to attract healthy experiences, because the internal posture itself communicates openness to excess, invasion, imbalance. Stoicism observes that the world responds to how we position ourselves within it, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Those who do not protect their boundaries teach others not to respect them. Those who overexplain communicate insecurity about their own worth. Those who accept anything end up receiving exactly that, not because they deserve it, but because they have not established a clear standard of acceptance. There is also the habit of confusing emotional intensity with quality. Turbulent relationships seem more alive. Unpredictable people seem more interesting. Situations that require constant effort give a false sense of meaning. Stoicism, on the contrary, values tranquility as a sign of alignment with reason. Where there is consistent peace, something is functioning properly. Where there is recurring drama, there is disorder, even when disguised as passion or purpose. In everyday life, this shows up in simple choices: staying in conversations that drain you, returning to situations that have already shown they are not good for you, giving second, third, endless chances, not out of rational conviction but out of fear of facing the emptiness that would come if it ended. Fear of absence sustains the presence of what hurts. And that fear, when left unexamined, becomes the true ruler of emotional life. Stoicism does not suggest eliminating fear, but understanding it, asking what it is trying to protect. Often the fear is not of losing the other person, but of losing an identity built around being accepted. If I am not needed, who am I? If I do not please, what remains? These questions reveal how much personal value has been outsourced to external approval. Over time, this outsourcing exacts a high price. The person begins to feel they are living to maintain fragile balances. They avoid saying what they think. They avoid expressing discomfort. They avoid making firm decisions. All to avoid disturbing relationships that deep down are already unbalanced. And in the process, their own reason is pushed aside, as if it were an obstacle to belonging. The Stoics saw reason as the most precious good of the human being, not in a cold sense, but as the capacity to discern, to choose with clarity, to act according to internal principles rather than momentary impulses or external pressure. When this reason is neglected, life becomes a chain of reactions. When it is preserved, even with difficulty, something begins to reorganize. At this stage of the process, there is still no visible change. The person may remain in the same environments with the same people, living similar situations. But internally, something starts to accumulate, an uncomfortable clarity, a discomfort that can no longer be dismissed with the same excuses, a sense that continuing this way is no longer a neutral option, but a conscious choice to stay in a pattern that demands too much and gives too little. This phase is marked by ambivalence. The person still wants to please but is growing tired of it, still fears distance but begins to fear losing themselves even more, still seeks approval but now sees how much it weakens them. Nothing is resolved. There are no final decisions. There is only a gradual increase in awareness of one's own role in the repetition of suffering. Stoicism calls this the beginning of the discipline of ascent, learning not to automatically accept everything that arises in the mind as truth. The idea that I need this to be valued, the belief that if I take a stand I will be rejected, the assumption that there are no better options. These ideas start to be seen as hypotheses, not as indisputable facts. And when this distinction begins to take shape, even timidly, something prepares itself deep within awareness. It is not yet full strength, it is not yet clear action, but it is a silent reorganization of internal criteria. As if the mind were slowly preparing for a shift in posture it does not yet know how to execute, but already senses is necessary to preserve something essential, one's own rational dignity, which begins to demand space, voice, and respect within one's own life, even if the world has not yet been confronted with it. It is precisely at this point that the shift begins to announce itself, not as a decision, but as an internal rupture. The person realizes that continuing in the same way is no longer just uncomfortable, it is incoherent. Something inside starts to resist, not aggressively, not as outward rebellion, but as a quiet refusal to keep betraying one's own reason. This is a delicate point because nothing has changed externally, yet everything starts to feel unsustainable on the inside. Most people make a mistake here because they believe change must begin with visible actions. They think that valuing themselves means confronting, explaining, justifying, announcing boundaries. But that reverses the natural order of things. Stoicism teaches that no external action is stable unless it is preceded by a clear internal decision. Otherwise, the gesture becomes an emotional reaction, not a rational stance. And emotional reactions tend to reinforce the very patterns one is trying to break. The first mistake, then, is trying to change other people's behavior before reorganizing one's own internal standards. When someone does not yet value themselves consistently, any attempt to set boundaries comes across as unstable. There is hesitation in the voice, too much explanation, fear of the outcome. Others sense this even unconsciously and respond by testing, pushing, or ignoring, not out of deliberate cruelty, but because the boundary was not supported by inner conviction. Stoicism does not begin by asking, "What should I do?" but rather, "What depends on me?" And that question changes everything. Other people's behavior does not depend on you. Their reactions do not depend on you. External approval does not depend on you. What does depend on you is the assent you give to your own thoughts, the value you assign to experiences, the way you decide to stay or to step away. When this becomes clear, something shifts at a deep level. Valuing yourself through a Stoic lens is not about inflating the ego. It is about aligning with reason. It is deciding that your own peace will no longer be used as currency. It is understanding that there is no real advantage in maintaining relationships that require the constant violation of your internal limits. This understanding does not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it brings fear, because removing value from the external means facing the temporary emptiness that appears when old patterns stop being fed. At this stage, short internal phrases begin to surface, almost uncomfortably, repeating themselves. Not everything that is offered deserves to be accepted. Not every presence is a gain. Not every connection is a sign of value. These ideas are not comforting, but they bring clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, strengthens more than any comfortable illusion. Most people go wrong because they confuse self-worth with emotional isolation. They believe that by respecting themselves, they will lose connections. But what is usually lost are not real bonds but disguised dependencies. Relationships built on excessive tolerance rarely survive once reason takes the lead. And that is frightening because it reveals an uncomfortable truth. Many connections existed not because of who you were, but because of what you were willing to accept. Stoicism does not promise that valuing yourself will immediately make everything better. It does not sell quick rewards. It simply states that losing your own dignity always costs more than losing any external relationship. And when this truth is genuinely understood, the axis of decision shifts. The question stops being, will I lose someone, and becomes, what am I losing every time I stay? At this stage, reason begins to reclaim its space, not as rigid emotional control, but as criterion. The person starts observing their reactions with more distance. They notice the anxiety that appears before a conversation. They recognize the impulse to over-explain. They become aware of the fear of disappointing others. And instead of acting immediately, they begin to pause. That pause is the beginning of Stoic freedom. Short phrases start gaining internal strength. I can tolerate the discomfort of not pleasing everyone. I don't need to resolve everything right now. Silence is also an answer. These are not motivational mantras. They are rational reminders. They help the mind avoid panic in the face of possible rejection, because panic always leads to self-betrayal. The shift in awareness happens when the person realizes that self-worth is not built by reacting better, but by choosing better. Choosing where to invest energy. Choosing when to speak and when to walk away. Choosing not to negotiate what one knows, quietly, is essential to one's integrity. This choice is not made once. It is made repeatedly, in small situations, often invisible to others. Another common mistake is waiting to feel strong before acting firmly. Stoicism reverses this. Firmness comes before the feeling of strength. First comes the rational decision. Then gradually the emotions adjust. Waiting for full confidence before taking a stand keeps a person trapped in the old pattern, because confidence only solidifies after reason is exercised, not before. Little by little, the person begins to realize that many emotions they once interpreted as love were actually fear. Fear of losing space, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. When reason sheds light on this, something calms down. Not because fear disappears, but because it no longer commands. Stoicism does not eliminate emotions. It puts them in their proper place. Valuing yourself starts to mean something very concrete. Not abandoning yourself in your thoughts, not diminishing yourself in conversations, not justifying choices that harm no one. It means sustaining your no without excessive guilt. It means accepting that not everyone will stay once you stop adapting, and accepting that without turning the loss into proof of personal failure. This internal change begins to alter how the world responds, not magically, but logically. People who benefited from your excessive flexibility drift away. Situations that required your self-negation stop seeming attractive. And at the same time, a new space begins to open up. A space where the mind is no longer constantly on alert, where the presence of others is not required to sustain your sense of worth. Stoicism calls this alignment with one's rational nature. When the mind stops begging for validation and starts operating from internal criteria, something strengthens quietly. The person becomes less reactive, less available to what drains them, more selective without becoming arrogant. Not because they see themselves as better than others, but because they stop treating themselves as less important. This shift is not immediately visible from the outside. It happens first in how the person thinks, then in how they feel, and only later in how they act. That interval is uncomfortable, because the old pattern still calls out, still tries to reassert itself. The mind asks whether this is an overreaction, whether it is being too harsh, whether it will end up alone. This is exactly where reason must be protected, not with rigidity, but with clarity. Stoicism teaches that the mind must be guarded like a fortress, not to isolate it from the world, but to prevent constant invasions that destabilize it. Each time a person sustains an internal boundary, even while trembling, something consolidates. Each time they resist the urge to over-explain, something grows stronger. This is not yet the end of the process. It is not the climax. What exists now is preparation, a quiet reorganization of values, a redefinition of what is acceptable, what is desirable, what will no longer be tolerated. The person begins to understand that attracting something better is not about attracting more, but about attracting what does not require the loss of oneself. This understanding is still forming. It has not yet fully translated into action, but it has already created a new kind of tension, different from before. A tension between continuing to live as before or sustaining this new clarity all the way through, even without knowing exactly what the consequences will be, even without guarantees, even with the growing discomfort of realizing that something essential is about to be claimed, not as theory, but as direct responsibility for one's own mind and for the value one now decides, from this point forward, no longer to negotiate. It is at this point that clarity finally organizes itself, not as an intense emotion but as a calm decision. The person understands that self-worth is not something you declare out loud, nor something you prove to the world. Self-worth is something you practice quietly every day, in how you think, in how you feel, in how you respond, and most importantly, in how you choose not to respond. Stoicism calls this the governance of the mind, not rigid control but conscious leadership. The mind stops being an open territory where any opinion enters, any behavior is tolerated, any emotion takes command. It begins to operate with criteria. And where there are criteria, there is order. Where there is order, there is tranquility, even if the world remains unstable. Valuing yourself then stops being an abstract idea and becomes something deeply practical. It starts with thoughts. Thoughts that once automatically turned against yourself begin to be observed more carefully. The mind notices when it tries to justify what cannot be justified, when it minimizes its own discomfort, when it reframes disrespect as a misunderstanding. At that moment, reason intervenes, not harshly, but precisely. This is not good for me. This is not aligned with what I know. This does not need to be accepted. In emotions, the change is also subtle, yet decisive. Stoicism does not teach the suppression of feelings, but rather not being governed by them. Anxiety may still arise. Fear of loss may still appear. Loneliness may still be felt. But these emotions stop being commands and become signals. They inform, but they do not decide. Decision-making returns to reason. This distinction is crucial. Before, the person acted to relieve immediate emotions. Now they begin to act to preserve their own integrity, even if that creates temporary discomfort. Quick relief loses its importance. Coherence gains space. And this exchange completely changes the quality of the experiences one accepts. In conversations, this transformation becomes visible, even if discreetly. The person speaks less, but with more firmness. Explains less, because there is no longer a need to convince. Falls silent when they sense that any word would once again place them in a defensive position. Silence, once feared, becomes a tool of preservation, not as punishment for others, but as protection of one's own clarity. Boundaries change as well. They are not announced with rigidity nor imposed with aggression. They show up in consistency, in not returning to places where there was disrespect, in not insisting where there is no reciprocity, in not adapting to environments that require the loss of inner peace. A real boundary is not what you say, it is what you sustain. Stoicism teaches that what you tolerate, you authorize, and what you authorize repeats itself. When a person stops authorizing what diminishes them, the landscape inevitably changes. Some people step away. Some situations come to an end. That can hurt, but the pain is different. It is not the pain of self-betrayal. It is the pain of transition, a clean pain that does not corrode from the inside. Then something curious happens, not immediately, and not as a guaranteed reward, but as a natural consequence. life begins to respond differently. Not because the world became better, but because the internal criteria became firmer. What is not aligned no longer lasts very long. What demands self-betrayal no longer feels attractive. What once seemed rare begins to appear more clearly. Respect, simplicity, reciprocity. Attracting the best in this context is not about attracting more people, more opportunities, more stimulation. It is about attracting what does not require you to abandon yourself in order to exist. What does not drain you? What does not confuse you? What does not demand constant effort just to be maintained? The best is not intense, it is stable, not loud but clear, not dramatic but dignified. Stoicism never promised a life without loss. It promised a mind capable of moving through loss without destroying itself. When a person truly begins to value themselves, they spend less time trying to fix what was never balanced, and more time investing in what grows without internal violence. This posture does not push the world away. It filters it. It does not close the heart. It protects it. It does not create superiority. It creates alignment. The person remains human, sensitive, open, but now with criteria, with direction, with responsibility for their own inner state. In the end, everything comes down to a quiet choice, repeated daily, to protect one's own reason or to hand it over in exchange for momentary acceptance. Stoicism is clear about this. Everything you do not govern within yourself will eventually govern you, and everything you govern with clarity becomes solid ground, even when the world wavers. Valuing yourself is not an act of ego. It is an act of sanity. It is deciding that your mind deserves peace, that your emotions deserve respect, that your life will not be lived as a reaction to others' behavior, but as a conscious expression of what you know, deep down, to be right for you. If this reflection resonated with you, it may be worth staying on this path of clarity. Liking this content, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment, not as an obligation, but as a natural extension of this conscious choice, can be a simple gesture of presence and responsibility for what you consume, think, and allow into your own mind.